We talked in the last two lectures about woody plants, and woody plants are a form of perennial plant. And so I don't want to finish this without talking to you about how some of our thoughts on managing and planting translate into perennial gardening, which is what many of us love to do, to generate all this beautiful color and texture in our gardens. So what do we need to do to be good perennial gardeners? Well, you've had the intro bio lecture, so you know about the life cycle of an annual. They go from seed to seed in a single year and then die. And biennials, which go from seed to seed in 2 years and then die. And then perennials, which are either herbaceous or woody, and that live longer than 2 years. Now, being a perennial doesn't mean you live forever, but it means you live longer than 2 years. And what happens every year is that you will flower and possibly produce some seed, but then when fall comes, you don't die, you go dormant, and your root system remains alive until the following spring when the root and crown of the perennial put out new growth. So that's called an herbaceous perennial. So that's primarily what we're going to talk about today. Annuals can be classified in a number of different ways, often by frost tolerance. We have hardy annuals, which are highly resistant to frost, things like sweet pea. Half-hardy annuals that need some protection from fall frost, like ageratum, and then tenure annuals, which can't take any frost and may even be damaged by cold temperatures above freezing, and coleus would be an example of that. And then garden plants can be classified in many other ways. They can be classified by site preference, sun plants and shade plants, by size, front, mid, or back border. Perennials by the frequency of division. Some never need to be divided, like baptisia. Others like to be divided every few years, like ornamental grasses. And some need to be divided every year, and if that's the case, you probably shouldn't have it in your garden because it will take over. Garden plants can also be classified by behavior as perennials or wildflowers or even weeds, or by history, plants that lend themselves to cottage gardens, to Victoria gardens, or to gardens that specialize in the hot and the new plants. Bottom line, as we saw with trees and shrubs, is that the garden site will dictate which plants you can grow well. And so early on, you should assess each of the following factors. The soil conditions, which include pH, texture, and organic matter levels. Competition for moisture, competition with turf or with other perennials, or just the moisture holding capacity of the soil. Irrigation, where is the water going to come from and where is the water going to go? Do you have wet spots? Do you have excessively well-drained soils? Light levels are really important. Sun and shade, whether it's morning sun or afternoon sun, or shade all day. And then garden microclimates, which you can only learn about by observing your garden over a period of time, either a day or even longer. Sun and shade patterns, frost pockets, slopes and contours in the garden that either contribute to drainage or flooding or standing water or even changes in temperature. Wind patterns, hardscaping, the presence of walls and fences and pavers and even buildings can lend wonderful opportunities to plant marginally hardy perennials and have them survive better if they're close to a wall or a building. For example, here we have on the left a hot, dry microclimate. This is a well-drained soil, excessively well-drained soil in full sun. And so what this does is if we plant things like tough intermontane natives that are from the desert southwest, or Mediterranean type plants that survive in full sun and dry conditions, these are gardens that will do well for us. On the other hand, if you have a cool, moist microclimate, and this might be, for example, on the north or east side of a building, or in an area with a heavier soil, or with an over canopy of trees, these are areas where plants will stay wet after the rain and hold snow for weeks at a time in the winter. So we're going to have a whole different palette of plants that would be suitable for this kind of garden climate. In soil conditions, much of this can be assessed just by touch and feel. You can hold a soil and tell whether it's a soil that's going to hold water or be much drier and excessively well drained. You can look at the soil type and actually do a hand soil textural analysis to see if you have sand or clay or loam. You can do a soil test to test the pH. Some plants like a higher pH, some like more acidity. And you can often feel and tell from the color of the soil how much organic matter it has, or you can send it in and get this tested by a testing lab. Sun patterns are very important, and there are many differences that are important to understand. Obviously, if you have full sun, you're going to use plants that are tolerant of full sunlight, and many times this information is available on the plant tag. Part sun and shade is something that really matters in whether it's morning sun or afternoon sun. Morning sun, when the air temperatures are cool, is much more forgiving than afternoon sun that is on the plants when the air temperatures are high and the soil will be drier. So the west side of your house, even if it receives only 3 or 4 hours of sun, it's going to be a whole different environment than 3 to 4 hours of sun on the east side or the north side of your house. So it is helpful to pay attention to plant tags. If a plant says it needs full sun, then you darn well better give it at least 6 hours of sun a day, or it won't be very happy. If it tells you it needs shade, you really want to keep it out of the sun or in just very light dappled sun if possible. The shape of the garden can have a tremendous impact, both in terms of maintenance and the conditions that the plant experiences. Island beds can be laid by turf or in pavement. Borders will border fences, walls, hedges, or foundation beds will border the building. And remember that even within a bed, you can have varying light, wind, and moisture conditions. Plants on the edge of the bed are going to experience much more drying, particularly if they're on the south or the west side of the bed. And plants that are in the middle will tend to stay wet longer and have deeper root systems and will have more access to moisture. So these are an example of island beds. So we have turf on both sides of this garden bed. The advantage here is that you can walk around and view these plants from both directions. It's very easy to maintain beds like this because you can reach in from both directions very easily. And you can get really dramatic textures in the garden by varying foliage textures and flower colors and plant heights, etc. So island beds are an excellent way of gardening with perennials. Borders are up against something else. So they may be up against a woodland, or they might be up against a backdrop of conifers or other woody plants. These are more difficult to maintain in that you need to leave room at the back of the bed to get in there and reach into these plants from behind. And then you also have to think about plant heights more in this case, and put your low plants out front and your taller plants in the back, and have a variety of plant heights and colors, and hopefully repeating colors as you move along down the bed as a design principle. Foundation plants can be very problematic. Many people put in foundation beds that are much too narrow. They're difficult to reach in and get behind these. There's no access from behind to reach these plants, these hydrangeas, for example, or daylilies in the back. And so the temptation, or what you should do rather, is to make foundation beds much wider. I say a minimum of 6 feet wide with at least a 1 foot or 2 foot access alleyway in the back between the bed and the foundation of the house. But these can be important in terms of softening up the edges on the house and providing, and it's often the only place that people really have to garden is up against the building. You just want to make sure you put enough space in there. So let's talk about garden bed preparation for a moment. This is a very critical step, is to get the soil right and get the bed right before you put plants in. So everything from soil testing to eliminating weeds is important. eliminating weeds seems obvious, but there are certain steps that are involved. If you have sod, that's wonderful because you can remove the sod. Very often it's fairly weed-free beneath that. Otherwise, you need to dig out any perennial roots and pull out any weeds and make sure that new weeds aren't going to come up. You can prevent new weeds from coming up using mulch or newspaper or solarizing with clear plastic. And whatever weeds pop up, you just need to stay on top of it for a while, and then you'll usually be okay. If you need to, at the time that you're preparing the bed is when you should add organic matter and soil amendments. This is probably the most important step in bed preparation. With perennials, unlike trees and shrubs, the root systems are much shallower, so you can have a much greater impact by amending the soil. You still want to add at least 50% organic matter by volume. I love to use compost as long as it doesn't have any weeds in it. You can also use peat moss or leaf mold or anything of that sort. It will all break down eventually. I've even used wood chips as a soil amendment many times, and the worms go crazy on the wood chips, and it all turns into nice rich soil after a few years. So you can spend a lot of money amending soil, or you can spend very little if you take advantage of leaf humus that's available at municipal transfer stations, or using leaf mold raked out of the woods, things of that sort. Just make sure you're not bringing a weed problem in with whatever material you're using. This is particularly a problem with topsoil. Often topsoil has been stored and has had weeds growing in it, and the seed get into the soil, and then you're just going to have a weed problem when you bring that in. So you want to make sure that you don't have weed-infested topsoil in particular, or even compost. When you're storing materials, don't let weeds grow in that. If they start to grow in it, they'll go to seed very quickly, and then you'll have your amendment that is full of weed seeds. You want to turn the existing soil first, remove any rocks and perennial weeds, roots, things of that sort. Stir the soil up well to typically a depth of at least a foot or so. Rake that out and then add 4 to 6 inches of organic matter, an equivalent depth as you've dug deep. So up to 8 to 12 inches of organic matter on top, and then turn that in again, and then rake it and smooth it, and you'll have a wonderful planting medium for your perennial beds. Just some of the steps shown here on a property. They're removing the weeds and the sod to create a foundation bed, and then digging down and adding organic matter and turning it, and then raking it out smooth. And notice how they're leaving access stones in the back that are marking the back access to the bed. So it's almost like an island bed in that it has a back access point so that you can maintain it from both the turf, from the lawn side and from the house side. And this is what you end up with. A perfect preparation will yield perfect plants. Get your plants off to the right start, and you'll be one happy perennial gardener. So I do not know much about design, but when you're talking about perennial gardening, it is good to always think about design of the garden, and I'll recommend a good web resource in just a moment. When you're designing, though, from a perspective of growing good plants, the first thing you want to do is consider the available conditions, as we've already spoken about, and then think about your desired garden elements. What are you looking for in terms of plant height? Are you trying to stay under a certain height? Or are you trying to create dramatic gardens with tall plants in them? What textures are you looking for? Perennials can be quite coarse or very fine textured, and they'll have different colors both in bloom time and in the fall as they start to go dormant. So you can come up with beautiful combinations of color and texture and height that will work together to make a stunning perennial garden. The other issue is time of bloom, which often it scares me, so it probably scares other people as well, in terms of picking plants that will be in bloom at the right time. And some people want their gardens to be in bloom continuously from May until frost. That's difficult to achieve, frankly. There tends to be hot times like early in the year. May and early June will tend to be very bright, You'll have another group of plants that will bloom in July and August, and then you'll have a third group of plants that will come in the fall. So getting those all in there and in the right order so that you always have good design being maintained throughout the bloom period that's the real challenge in perennial garden design. And you need to think about the different parts of the border. These are some examples of front border plants that would go down in front. Typically, they stay under 1 foot tall or so. And then you have mid border and back border plants. And laying these out really is about creating repetitive elements in terms of color and texture and height so that the viewer is drawn through the garden with interest and encountering new plants and interesting and beautiful plants as they move along. A wonderful resource which I'd recommend is Leonard Perry, who's a horticulture professor now retired up at the University of Vermont. Leonard Perry has something called Prairie's Perennial Pages, and the web address for that is uvm.edu /pass/Perry/. And that address will get you to a wonderful resource on perennials. He has a blog, and he also has downloadable information on perennials and perennial garden design. So Prairie's Perennial Pages. Mid-border plants is a whole nother aspect of perennial gardening. Plants that get much taller. Sometimes many of our ornamental grasses fit into this category. They can get quite tall, and you want to pick things that will combine well with the permanent elements of your garden, such as trees and conifers and evergreens that form the backbone of the garden. So things like everything, some of my favorite are bear's breeches and Amsonia. Delphiniums can be quite dramatic because they grow tall and vertical and have those deep blue and purple colors. Lupins and Liatris, things that tend to be more either taller or have a more vertical posture to them, will make good mid-border plants. Many people plant by the numbers, and others are collectors. I'm a collector. I have one of everything. And Ken Druce, who's a wonderful garden writer and speaker, has some good books out there. One that I like is called The Collector's Garden. And others will plant in large masses, sort of the Pete Odif school of perennial gardening, which is to put in large drifts of similar plants or the same plant so that you develop sort of like a whole architectural aspect of the perennial garden. And beautiful gardens are quite stunning. You see here by this tennis court a mixture of textures from the very coarse foliage of Coryngosoma to the fine texture of lavender and loosestrife, and you can see the vertical platters of Achillea, of yarrow, and we can see the echinacea with their bold heads and bold colors, and the lady's mantle, and all the beautiful plants that provide a variety of colors and textures in here. And combining all these is where the art of perennial gardening comes in. But you notice an important element of perennial gardening here is repetition. So you see the same plants over and over again, and that draws your eye through the garden. We see that again just with the mid-border plants and also with the front border plants. The Coreopsis planted down in front repeats 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 to pull you around, to pull your eye around and get you engaged with the garden. Same thing, the same effect here using this, the allium, the giant allium here. Just having them popping up over and over again pulls your eye through the garden. And what otherwise, when it's not in bloom, as you can see here, would be a fairly uniform and fairly boring garden. Just adding some purple to contrast with the chartreuse here, a little bit of iris coming up, so you can tell this is in the spring, late spring, before this garden has come into full bloom. So you can just imagine this garden, by the time the allium fades, the rest of these plants will be in bloom, so it should be beautiful. And again, that pulls you down this path as you tour the garden. Contrasting colors. As I'll show you in a minute, there's colors that go well together, and this is an example of where verticality here goes with the horizontal yarrow, goes with the vertical loosestrife. So that's a combination that is very effective in terms of just establishing a balance in the garden. I guess that's what I'd call this. It's a color balance of contrasting colors and a architectural balance of vertical and horizontal. So when you're selecting plants, make sure you choose healthy plants. You want them to be disease resistant. You want them to be long blooming. You want them to come in with a succession of bloom. You want good contrasts of colors and textures. And yet you want to blend these so that they go together well, the right combinations. And of course, recognizing the importance of promoting our native flora and preventing problems with invasive species. We should use natives whenever possible. And we want to make sure they're cold hardy. You should be familiar with what the cold hardiness zones are in your area. In Rhode Island, we tend to run between zone 5B or 6A and 7A. So you want to pick plants that are hardy to that area or farther south, or rather farther north, I should say. Beware of certain plants, things that are called perennials but aren't really, like Coreopsis lime rock ruby. We call these temperennials because they're sold as perennials, and they may last 2 years, but then after that they'll be gone. And then others, Lithamachia clethroides, the gooseneck loosestrife, is a really beautiful plant in bloom. So you plant one of those, and before you know it, you're chasing it around the garden and wondering why you planted it in the first place. I've had it in my yard for many, many years. I let it grow a little bit, but then I chase it around and try to kill it. And it's one jump ahead of me. And remember, when you're buying plants, nursery plants don't have to be stunning specimens to be good plants. This is an echinacea at its peak in the season, and this is a sunflower later on in the season. Just because it's starting to go dormant doesn't mean that it is dead. It just means that all the energy has been put back into the root system. So it's actually quite easy to pick plants that look like they're a little bit past their prime, and then you can actually divide those and have several plants for the price of one. And if it's late in the season, you might even get them on sale. So unlike trees and shrubs growing in containers, in which we don't recommend buying plants late in the season because of the risk of them being pot bound, for perennials that actually works better. Because as long as you can pull them out of the pot and recognize fresh growth and a healthy root crown, then you can take that and divide it and like I said, get several plants for your money. So you want to lay your plants out in a design or a pattern before you plant them. Make sure that each of them has plenty of room to develop. So you should have some idea of what size that plant will be, say within the first 5 years, so that you'll know whether you're going to have to go in and divide it or whether you should give it some more room. Remove the plants from the pots carefully, tease out the roots. It's much easier to do this even on pot-bound perennials than it is on any woody plant. Divide them if necessary, and then plant them at the correct depth. It's not quite as critical as with woody plants because the crown of the plant is sort of meant to be in contact with the soil, but you still want to get those at the right depth. And you want to make sure every year that they haven't jumped out of the ground from frost heaving. So one of my spring tasks is to go around and step on perennials and make sure they're at the right depth in the soil. I told you I was going to talk about colors. When you have gardens, they can be hot, they can be cold or cool, but you want to make sure that you have colors that work well together. And that's the aspect of the color wheel. The idea behind a color wheel is that colors that are either opposite or connected by a triangle are the ones that go well together. And you want a certain balance of hot and cool colors. So the hot colors like yellow through red will be combined, for example, yellow and red with blue, which is one of the coolest colors. Or you can have a single hot color like orange combined with green and purple, which are somewhat cooler colors, but not as extreme as dark blue. Or you can go with colors that are directly across from each other. So yellow combines well with purple, as you see here. Orange combines well with blue, as you see right here in the back border plants of this plan. and green will go well with pink or with red. So those are combinations that work well together. So keep that in mind. It's more pleasing to the eye, and you'll be happier with that, and you won't have hot and cold spots in your garden bed. And then I love this diagram because it sort of shows the ratios to use these in as well. You have light and dark, for example, yellow and purple, and hot and cold, orange or red, and green or blue. And combining these, it suggests that you combine orange, for example, with 2/3 blue and 1/3 orange. Because of how strong orange is, you want to make sure it's balanced by plenty of blue. And similarly, red and green are more balanced colors, so they can be used half and half. But yellow, which is a very hot, bright color, should be used with a 1/4 ratio with 3/4 of purple. So the other question is, will it be in bloom from May to September? It doesn't always matter. I know landscapers who have clients that are here only in the summer, so they really only need their gardens to be in bloom from mid-June through the end of August, and then come Labor Day, they're gone. They don't really care. So you can skip all the fall blooming plants and focus on plants that bloom in the summer. So it really depends on when your client is around and when you're in the garden. So in terms of fertilizing, I'm not that excited about fertilizer. Most soils contain adequate fertility for plants. But most perennials, as opposed to woody plants, will benefit from some fertilizer, but they don't necessarily need a lot. And some need even less. Grasses and succulents and plants with silver foliage need much less fertilizer than your average garden plant. And remember that if you are amending or adding organic matter, or if you're mulching, there are nutrients, and many times adequate nutrients, in that material. So don't over fertilize. It'll just make your plants grow longer and taller, and they'll tend to fall over more, and it won't necessarily always be a good thing. It's not the same as vegetable gardening. If you use too much nitrogen, you can end up with lots of deep green foliage, but you'll get fewer flowers because the plants are putting all their energy into vegetative growth, and they may even get floppy, and it's really a no-no to fertilize grasses. If you have a slow-release granular, it's easy to apply, but make sure it doesn't gather in the foliage and burn the plant as it dissolves. It'll also have a slower response. And soluble fertilizers can often have more nitrogen in them and a faster response, but they have to be applied as a liquid. Organic fertilizers will add organic matter, but they're much less concentrated. The nitrogen levels are quite low compared to synthetic fertilizers, but many people prefer organic fertilizers because synthetic fertilizers are derived from fossil fuels. Synthetic fertilizers also won't last in the garden as long, so organics are often a benefit because they'll add organic matter and work over a longer period of time. So these are just some examples of organic and commercial fertilizers. And just looking at the label, you can see all the natural materials that organic fertilizers are made from. This often makes them more expensive than synthetic fertilizers, but at least you can pronounce what's on the label. When you're fertilizing, the best way to fertilize is to do a targeted application around the plants that need fertilizer. You don't need to fertilize everything. I'll go in, for example, often and fertilize certain plants with a little bit of lime and some fertilizer every year if they need it, but I won't fertilize everything, and then scratch it into the ground so the fertilizer is in good contact with the soil. There's even some fertilizers that contain ammonia, and if you leave that on the surface of the soil, that ammonia can volatilize and it will blow away in the wind, and you won't have any nitrogen left. So make sure you scratch your fertilizer into the soil after you apply it. So mulching is always controversial. A well-designed garden that is completely filled in with plants often doesn't need to be mulched. But mulching does help keep down the weeds. It holds in moisture. And in young gardens in particular, when the plants are widely spaced, the mulch can look nice. It provides organic matter. And you should use light textured mulches. Don't use heavy mulches that will smother the plants. Keep them away from the crown of the perennials. Don't smother them. And it's best to not mulch until the soil is warmed up, because the mulch can actually keep the soil cold and slow down your plant growth. Now, irrigation in gardens is as they're getting established is quite important. Obviously, the best water is free water that comes from the sky. But if you do need to irrigate, it's important to think about the health of your plants and the most efficient and economical way to apply water to your landscape. So you might look at overhead irrigation, which is sprinkler irrigation or drip irrigation or even flooding. But as you design your irrigation system or think about how you're going to water your plants, think about where the water is going to go. If you're irrigating on a slope, is it just going to run downhill? Do you need to create watering basins around your newly planted perennials, for example? Is there good drainage? Are you going to experience runoff? And if you, after you irrigate, do you have areas of standing water that could create a problem for plants that are sensitive to flooding conditions? So basically, newly planted perennials need watering to become established, and you have to maintain watering. And the water should be deep water, not shallow water, because you want the roots to grow deeply into the soil. And the best way to promote that is to water lawn waterings very close to the root system. So this is one reason why when I plant perennials, I'll also create small water berms around the plants and then fill those berms with water, those watering basins with water several times. And you want to apply about 1 inch of water per week. And you want to water early in the day so the foliage doesn't stay wet overnight, which can promote disease. And don't overwater your perennials, because if you drown them out, they will die faster than from any other cause. If you have an automatic irrigation system, make sure that you set it to water less frequently and for a longer duration so that it will give you water absorption deeper into the soil. Drip irrigation is wonderful to conserve water. And bottom line is don't irrigate your gardens the same way you irrigate your lawn, because you'll end up with shallow-rooted, poorly established plants. So here's an example of a soaker hose as it's laid out in a perennial garden. It can be above or below the mulch. And this is an artistic overhead irrigation system. So in terms of maintaining the garden, deadheading can be very important and pruning can be very important. Deadheading is removing spent flowers, and this can both improve the appearance and prolong blooming, because if you remove the energy sink for seed production, more energy will go into producing more flowers. It also prevents self-seeding for any perennials that might tend to spread on their own, and it makes a healthier plant by directing more energy back into the roots and the vegetative growth of the plant. So deadheading can be done by hand or with a pair of pruners, depending on how easily those spent flowers come off. A number of tools. Really, for perennial gardening, what you like to use is what you should use. I've seen people use household scissors to work in the garden, and I see people that prefer more heavy-duty, specialized equipment. It really is a matter of what works for you. But you do want to keep your tools sharp, clean, and well-oiled so that they continue to work for you for a long time. So this is an example of deadheading. Daylilies, after the flowers are spent, they will drop off on their own, but if you want them to look fresh, you can go in and just snap those off very easily, just by working your way through. This is catmint that is grown over a path, and cutting this back, you want to do it in a way that it leaves the nice soft edge on it. So the way I would do this would be to reach in randomly and cut back deeply into the plant, working along the top, and then come along the bottom and make deep cuts way in at the bottom of the plant to free up that pathway, but leave the plant looking loose and open and natural rather than shearing it and cutting all those beautiful blooms off. This is Shasta daisy, which is being cut down, and this, after it's bloomed, the plant starts to look ratty, and yet if you cut this back, it'll actually put up new growth from the base and be fresh again, and maybe even put in a second bloom late in the summer and early fall. So if you time your pruning and deadheading operations correctly, you can have a lot of benefits, extend the beauty of the foliage, and even get a second bloom sometime. Russian sage is another one that tends to look ratty after it is finished flowering. So this is very easy to go in and gather that up and just cut it back basically by about half and leave those stiff stems, and they'll put out new growth on those stems and look really good within a month or so. And this is globe thistle, another one that those heads turn brown and don't look very pretty after they've bloomed, but it's very easy to cut those way down, leaving a layer of fresh foliage at the base. It tends to put up new foliage midsummer after it's bloomed, and just cut to the foliage that looks good and take out the dried up, tired foliage, and you'll have a nice fresh looking plant that'll give you a good textural detail for the rest of the season. And daylilies can be cut back hard or they can be tied up, whatever your preference is. I like to go in once or twice a year and just rake through those leaves, sometimes with a soil rake even, to pull out the dead foliage, and I find that leaves the plants looking very fresh. And then I can cut the tips off with hedge trimmers or with a pair of pruners. So weeding is a very important part of perennial gardens. The main part is not to let the weeds go to seed, because if they do, they'll spread. You need to know the kind of weeds that you're dealing with, whether they're perennial weeds or annual weeds, whether they're grasses or broadleaved weeds. I don't recommend using Roundup in perennial gardens because Roundup is a non-selective translocated herbicide, so it's either going to kill everything it touches, or it may get moved through the root system and interact with the roots of your desirable perennial plants and kill them as well, or at least set them back. It's great to get out and weed after a rain because the soil is softer and the roots come out more easily. But you scratch around in the soil, it loosens the soil up, and you can get your weeds out. You want to try to, when you weed, you want to make sure you're not just pulling the tops off the weeds. You also want to try to get the roots out as well. And of course, part of weeding is attitude. And so I say, just keep saying this is very satisfying as you weed, and it will be. Better than letting it go to that. Weeding tools are really a matter of personal preference. It really depends on the kind of weed you have. If you have a lot of annual weeds, a shuffle hoe is great because if you cut the tops off, they're dead. For more perennial weeds or deeper rooted weeds or quackgrass or things that grow by stolons, you may need to get in and dig deeper with a garden fork or with the twist tine device to loosen the soil up so you can get more of those roots out. It really depends on the kind of weed. But if you have the right tools, then weeding won't be such a chore. In terms of pinching, one of my favorite authors is Tracy DeSabato-Ost. She is out of Ohio State University. She worked with Steve Still there and came up with a couple of wonderful books on how to maintain perennial gardens. And she's a big advocate of pinching plants to extend bloom. And she has wonderful prescriptions in her books on how to pinch plants to extend the bloom of things from sedums to Boltonia to helianthus and phlox and all sorts of garden plants. So she's a wonderful gardener with wonderful advice. So I'd strongly recommend any book by Tracy DeSabato-Ost and go see her if she gives a talk. These are just some slides of pinching phlox. When phlox is starting to get leggy in the spring, if you want to extend the bloom, go in on about half the stems and pinch them back halfway to the lower nodes. And what you'll get is new growth from the lower nodes that will ripen and flower later than the older growth, the original growth. So you can have the original growth and bloom followed by extended bloom from the new growth that comes from the pinching operation. So that's just an example. I love to pinch my Maynarda. I'll actually take my clump of Maynarda and cut it at two different heights. So the uncut will bloom first. The halfway cut will bloom a week later or 2 weeks later, and then the lowest cut plants will bloom even after that. So I can take Maynarda, the bee balm, which would normally only be in bloom for a week or 10 days in the summer, and extend the bloom almost to an entire month if you do it properly. Staking is often necessary in perennial gardens because plants will get floppy, and the blooms, if your plant isn't upright when it comes into flower, then the blooms are usually ruined. So you want to stake before the plant reaches full maturity and comes into flower. Hide the stakes if you can. Be careful around stems and buds that could be easily broken. And don't just tie your plants up tight. That doesn't look attractive. Try to use natural methods such as corrals or crisscross stakes that will allow them to sort of look natural but not fall over completely. And this just shows staking delphinium to keep, because if you don't do that and the flowers, the flower stalks are at an angle when it comes into bloom, it'll never look right. So you have to get these staked before they come into bloom. And you just do a couple of loose ties of the flowering stem to the stake. And notice they're using green bamboo stakes that blend in with the foliage. And this is using crisscross stakes to tame lady's mantle. And it's just, you want to keep it out of the lawn so you don't run over it with the lawnmower. So you just take a couple of those little bamboo stakes and stick them into the ground and cross them and then lay them against the foliage. And that'll hold the foliage off the ground so you can get the mower past there without scalping your perennials. And this is corralling, where you use a combination of stakes and string to bring your plants in a little tighter so they're not laying all over each other. But don't do it too tightly so that they look like they're being strangled. Dividing is an important part of perennial garden maintenance. You should divide when plants get crowded and start to crowd other plants, or if the plant develops a hole in the center, which means that it's growing outwards and the inside has died, or if it's losing vigor or not blooming well enough, or if you just want to share your plants with plants. Share your plants with your friends. And you can divide basically any time of the year. Very often people do them when they clean the garden up in the spring or put it to bed in the fall. And what do you divide? Well, not all plants need dividing. Some resent being divided, like Baptisia, for example, or butterfly bush doesn't like to be divided. Not butterfly bush, butterfly weed. But you want to be careful of plants that have taproots. Ornamental grasses should only be divided in the spring, because if you divide them and move them in the fall, they usually won't make it. Hostas and daylilies and Shasta and phlox are easy to divide any time of the year. You can divide by digging the plant up, which is often the hardest part, and then cutting it into sections in the crown, depending on where the crown buds are growing. Using a sharp-edged spade or a double fork or a big sharp serrated knife tends to work pretty well too. And this is just an example with the stilbe. So this stilbe is getting large and growing towards the edge of the bed. So you want to both move it and divide it. So you dig it up, you cut it back first of all, and you notice that it's growing in a ring. The center's died out, and that's a sure sign that it needs to be divided. So you dig that plant up and divide it with a spade. And you can see how the crown is getting cut. That's okay. It won't damage it. It'll be fine as long as you have intact eyes with roots attached. And then you separate those out, and each one of those can be replanted. You can store those plants until they're given away by putting them in moist newspaper in a box. That works well. And then make sure you just keep them moist until they're back in the ground. So I just want to finish up by running through some of the month-by-month tasks that you would do in the garden, just a way to leave you with some thoughts about your coming gardening year. So in March, that's when I go in and as soon as I can get out in the garden and remove my winter mulch and cut my winter interest plants back, my sedums and ornamental grasses, get everything cut back to the ground so that when it comes up, you'll have fresh foliage. April is a good time to divide those plants that are getting too big for their spot. Top dress with some compost, fertilize, mulch, weed, any early weeds that are coming up, and particularly grasses. And then putting new plants in. May, continue planting. Put your hoops on your peonies, divide, mulch, prune your lavender. In June, stake and water, pinch your autumn flowering plants so that you'll have an extended bloom and fuller plants. Fertilize and deadhead. Keep planting to a minimum in July because it's hot and dry and you don't want to have to water too much. Cut back your repeat bloomers like delphinium and coreopsis and digitalis and lavender, and do some weeding. If you can get away with weeding just a couple times a year, usually July is one of the most important weedings. Keep your new plants well watered and watch for diseases. And in August, cut back plants that are done as they finish up for the year. Sometimes they'll put out a little bit of secondary growth that'll last through the winter, particularly with daylilies. Weed and cultivate, check your staking, apply fertilizer. Don't apply any fertilizer after this. In September, start working your beds for the following year. Plant fall plantings and bulbs for the following spring. Divide, cut down your spent plants, and move plants. And take self-sown seedlings and pot them up or move them to different parts of the garden. And then clean up the beds in October. Leave them as clean as you can and put down some fresh mulch late in the fall once the ground has frozen. And then in November, you finish top dressing the beds with compost and turn off and clean up your irrigation systems. And then December through February, you read and prepare for the following year, look at your notes and order plants and seeds and rest up and have a well-deserved winter nap. Thank you very much.